Therefore, the question of do we want our results to be widely variable, and therefore the amount of resource points that we're going to spend becomes unpredictable?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we going to have our results be real predictable, but the circumstances by which they are altered are very, very adjustable? That's -2 dice, that's +2. It's the little bonuses bounce up and down real fast. So that way, the predictability of it is only predictable for that roll. But that's it, because things are about to change, right?
Yeah. So like any sort of system, like dice pool or not, where the number on your sheet is a strong predictor of how you're going to do. I feel like those sorts of games would be great for people who love like the planning aspect, so that they can be sure that they're probably going to win under these circumstances, but they're not going to be sure if that's going to work, in all circumstances.
Right.
So if you really enjoy like the nitpicky planning out, getting the right gear and being in just the right place and waiting for him to come out at just the right time so you can take him out, that would be a lot of fun, because players who love all of that planning and detail just get crushed when it's like you have this huge variability and it's like, well, my planning didn't matter.
Well, it's true, but I also want to throw in another variable, which is that I'm not sure I ever believe anybody anymore when they say what they like in those terms. It's kind of a fellow at my site just casually referenced some data that he was familiar with, that coffee lovers will poll or interview consistently that they like a dark, bold roast. But that's not what turns out in taste tests. You do taste tests and everybody wants it light and medium.
Right. Yeah.
And I that struck me, just like I think it just did for you. When I read that, I was like, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
And I think people are it's a little interesting. I agree that preference has everything to do with this, but I just don't know what a person's preference is going to be until you actually take them through something. And
people's preferences change frequently from moment to moment.
Yeah, I have often noticed too, just to be a little cruel, that some of the planning type players that we're talking about, they actually play very, very cautiously. Because the less rolling, the less chance it is that their portraiture is going to get screwed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's kind of a bummer, right? I like to design dice systems to be used. That you go for the dice, you want to roll the dice, you want to see what happens. I'm interested in what you are working with. What tell me about your method at the moment.
I'm not designing one specific thing at the moment. Mostly what I design for is for kids, because I mostly run games for kids. Every week I run a usually dungeon crawl for fifth graders. And yeah, it's interesting because the accepted wisdom is that kids, don't want their characters to die, and they want to feel empowered all the time, and you should let them make all these choices. But then I went into like a very hardcore OSR mode with the kids, and one of the reasons why they liked it is they liked the challenge, and they like the feeling of planning things out and succeeding. Mm-hmm. So I tend to run games with very little rolling, if I can help it, or I encourage the kids to try and avoid rolling. They've realized that when we roll a lot, their characters tend to die.
Interesting.
And they've gotten better and better at it. So initially, like they see a monster, they just run straight into its mouth and they get eaten. But more recently, they've gotten better at considering the context, the environment, what exactly they're doing. And then I ask them very specific questions, like what exactly are you doing? How are you doing that? And they've gotten better at planning and engaging with the world because of that. Whereas the experience that I've had is that when they're rolling a lot, they think a lot less about what they're doing.
Yeah, that's really an interesting point, and it tends to run into a lot of the modern dialogues that I think aren't all that careful sometimes about how much fiction do we establish or nail down or imagine through dialogue prior to a roll.
Yes.
And I think that's a big deal personally, Just so you know, I think the quote mechanics first versus fiction first argument I think is completely sterile, and I do not participate in that dialogue. But they're related. I mean, these are related instances of activity, and I would be really interested. I'm thinking about some of the rolling and non-rolling stuff I've done in the in play, which purports to hark back to the old days. And regardless of what my experience of those old days may have been, there's an aesthetic now that everybody talks about. So
right.
if we do that, and one thing I found, I wrote about this a long time ago. Are you familiar with was it Munchkin or was it Hackmaster? I think it was the D20 Munchkin.
I'm familiar with like the party card game called Munchkin.
Right. They actually did a D20 role playing game.
Oh, okay.
Based on it.
All right.
And sort of a parodic version of, very much like Hackmaster, a parodic version of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons from the late 70s. And so the thing, to make a long story short, there was a monster, which was called a screaming geek, that came and jumped on you, attached itself to you, and screamed. And if you heard it, and you couldn't do anything, or rather, you couldn't fight because it grabbed you. And if you heard it, then its mother came out of the forest and kicks your ass. So I was playing my cleric. And there was a bridge. We were fighting on a bridge over a river. My cleric had an enormous constitution. I looked up the drowning rules. I was like, flip, looking up my drowning rules. And had chainmail on. The screaming geek got me. And I was like, no problem. Tipped myself over the edge of the bridge. Into the water. And by the rules, I wasn't going to drown. I knew exactly how. I had a little while before I drowned, and we were underwater. So therefore, the screaming geek, which the rules very specifically said, the geek will not stop screaming. So I pointed that to the DM and said, he drowns, and his mom won't come because he didn't scream for his mom.
Right.
Couldn't hear her. The DM was irked, right? Because I just I did a run around the monster.
Yeah.
There was no roll. I was playing with younger people who had never seen anybody do that with the rules before. I remember their faces. They were like, "You can't, but you can." Wait, what? This was real new to them.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that, and I was saying, isn't it interesting that you can take a dice system, which, to be cruel for a moment, that particular dice system that the game was using as its model, I do not find satisfying. People in the OSR, designate themselves OSR, have spent a lot of time doing innovative game design in order to keep certain aspects of the aesthetic but actually making a working dice system instead. And so that's why I think of the OSR as an extremely innovative design culture rather than just nostalgic retrocloning culture, which I don't think it is. Yeah. And so what I'm saying is that you get good at... Now, some people will call it gaming the system. Other people will call it rules lawyering. People might call it any number of things. But I maintain that if it's not disempowering other people, like you're not disempowering the DM by doing this, and they're not disempowering you when they look something up, but instead we're all just working with this text and this fiction because that's what we want to do, right? If that's the case, then those terms don't apply. It's just system. So, but you get really good at what is effectively a diceless system of unintentionally interactive text.
Yeah, I've been thinking more and more about that, just in terms of the degree to which you could push, D&D or OSR like systems towards something closer to a diceless system. Because, yeah, one thing that frustrates me in D&D in general is when I'm asked to roll for something that I could reasonably do. Just there's no reason why I wouldn't that wouldn't probably work. And so you're rolling for everything.
Yeah,
so it's like, do I notice the thing in front of me? It was like roll to find out. No.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know the texts, of D&D, with the exception of second edition, which I consider to be, I've stomped around in it briefly and said I'm never going back in that swamp. But for all the other texts of roleplay of D&D, just about, my favorite being Holmes from 1977. That's my fave. If I'm playing that, I find that there is no such rule mandating any such thing. We're dealing almost more with play culture about how to roll than we are with the rules for it.
Right.
So that's a sort of a footnote to that. But I would point out when it comes to combat narration, and particularly consequential combat narration, before you roll a hit and after, turning out what happens after you hit or miss. Since that's very unconstructed in D&D, really like super unconstructed, especially if you go back to those minute-long combat rounds and when there weren't any reactive, no attacks of opportunity. I think they came in with third edition. Maybe
sounds right.
And so so therefore, very unconstructed narration of what you did, or whether you slip on the rock, or how close you are to the edge of the precipice, based on the fact that you missed the guy. I'm fighting on the edge of the precipice. I missed, and is in one group. They say, well, it's a minute. You can be wherever you want. You've got a whole minute to go wherever you want in fighting this guy.
Yeah.
Period. Go where do you want to be? Or another DM will be more fine-grained and say, but that miss is a real thing in the fiction. It wasn't either cumulatively through a minute or at one climactic moment at the end of the minute, whatever, you ended up at a disadvantage. He's got your back to the precipice right now.
Yeah.
There's no fucking rules for that stuff.
Yeah, and that's very much GM fiat right there, in terms of just like...
I think of fiat as overriding something that already exists. I think of it as system design at the table.
Yeah.
As probably...
There's a sense of that.
Yeah, but as the more positive way of thinking of it, maybe. I mean, in the sense that we all know that this kind of talking is how we do it.
Yeah.
If we all just get that, then it might as well be in the rule book.
One of the really interesting things that I discovered more recently in the OSR is a bunch of different writers and so on who are trying to create systems that add more stuff to the narrative situation that allow for interesting rulings. So what I'm talking about is I had a conversation with Scrap Princess a while back on creating spells. And so what we were complaining about in general was the way that, especially like in 5th edition and 4th edition, almost all the spells are extremely rule-bound and mechanized. They're all just like number modifiers. Whereas in the OSR, and what I tend to enjoy personally, is spells that just do concrete physical things for which there are no rules.
Right. So what you have is you have a paragraph as the spell description, and the paragraph says a bunch of crazy shit. And then it's up to you to discover, in this particular circumstance, what's that crazy shit going to be doing.
Yeah. It enables the kind of shenanigans where people are like your story about your cleric on the bridge. It enables that sort of thing because it's creating all of these weird situations and tools that can be manipulated without having to create giant paragraphs of rules text to go along with it. Because like OSR assumes that the world is so complicated that you couldn't model it with all of this stuff, and it would be too annoying to do that anyway.
It would be interesting to see whether your generalization about the OSR has its deviance, whether there are some members of it who are, even as we speak, writing the careful tables.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So
yeah, that totally exists. I mean, especially for people who are really into things like second edition,
right.
Which had a lot of that grit. So yeah, there's all these weird factions within the OSR.